Hi everybody, Rad Mom here. Welcome back to the garden, where tonight we're going to be talking with Claire Craig, a young YouTuber who has posited radical feminism and TRAs as two sides of the same coin.
And these two groups are already going to be mad that I am lumping them together within the same ideological roots, but I will show and explain how they splinter off from one another.
She's got some interesting points actually, and it's going to be sort of a fun romp through modern feminist theory. Really quick though, please like the video if you enjoy my content and subscribe to the channel so we can all work together to bring feminism back into the real world because we desperately need it. She makes a lot of good observations actually, but as you will see, she's still operating in what I would call a masculinist mindset, meaning basically the unconscious assumption that male equals good and feminine equals bad.
Critical gender theory is the merging of postmodernist critical theory onto the gender ideology of radical feminism and is the backbone to understanding the modern feminist and trans discourse, as well as gendered identity politics in the West as a whole. And these two groups are already going to be mad that I am lumping them together within the same ideological roots, but I will show and explain how they splinter off from one another.
No, yeah. It's annoying, right? Because most of us think of ourselves as acting in opposition to all this critical theory postmodernist crap. But you know, she makes a couple of strong points and she's got an interesting perspective. I love that. I love that. She seems to have thought all this through on her own, I think. So, you know, like these are her own ideas. So it's really interesting.
We'll start with a basic, very basic understanding of what critical theory is. It differs from traditional theory in that instead of explaining phenomena through the application of universal laws, critical theory views knowledge as subjective and socially contingent,
which is claimed to be a universal law. Critical theory contradicts itself, even in this most basic understanding. The idea that knowledge is subjective is itself considered an objective truth, which is not a great starting point, really.
Because they view knowledge as a form of political power that has been constructed and repeated over time, rather than as some objective, observable truth, people can challenge oppressive truths through social critique and create new, liberatory forms of knowledge. These agreed-upon knowledges are to eventually lead to social actions that emancipate humanity from overarching oppressive structures. I want to read a quote from Mary Harrington's Feminism Against Progress that I found very relatable to my own experience at university, even though I went to university like 30 years later than she did. At university, I met the postmodern insight that language itself helps to shape meaning.
How is this in dispute exactly? Language does help shape meaning. That's part of its function.
And worse, that every sign can only be defined in relation to other signs.
And this way lies madness. Truly, checking your theories against observable reality is literally the basis of the scientific method. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got.
These, I was now told, serve to entrench covert hierarchies of class, sex, race, and so on. How all this was meant to relate to the material world, the pressures of survival, or the demands of physical life was less clear.
To decouple your perspective from the material world is to vainly attempt the impossible.
The mental shift from seeing the world in terms of stable meanings to seeing it in terms of power sent me, to say the least, a little bit loopy.
And it's small wonder that attempting this sends some people loopy.
Overnight, the hallowed buildings of Oxford University stopped looking like an expression of ancient traditions within which I could find my place. Suddenly, they were hostile incursions into my consciousness by something phallic, domineering, and authoritarian. I remember describing to a friend how I experienced the dreaming spires as barbed penises straining to fuck the sky.
This is a really interesting example, though, of how perception sort of does create reality, but that does have its limits.
So critical gender theory, then, is the ideological application of critical theory onto gender. And I say ideological because people do this in service of a political ideal, and that ideal matters more than the constitutive facts that either strengthen or weaken said argument. It's a basically utopian vision of overcoming oppression. And in this video, I'm going to argue that today there are two competing yet interrelated ideologies that utilize critical gender theory for those aims.
And to set us up in direct opposition to one another is not completely off base, right?
And those aims are to either 1, deconstruct scientific notions of sex and gender in order to create a world in which gender is subjectively defined, mutable, and divorced from physical reality, or 2, to abolish the social construction of gender entirely while retaining the notion of fixed biological sex.
By this definition, I don't even qualify as a radical feminist, though. Like, I know it's sort of heresy to admit that I do believe behavior has some biological basis, but I did not go into things believing this. I did not want to believe this either for a very long time.
Which is to be accomplished by achieving political equality between male and female sexes by overthrowing perceived patriarchy. And to generalize these two ideological functions of critical gender theory into camps, the first one is postmodern trans activism, and the other camp is trans-exclusionary radical feminism, also referred to as TERFs.
Sorry, trigger warning. If you consider TERF to be a slur, get ready.
But if we're going to explore the ideological origins of critical gender theory, we have to first begin with the gender creation myth. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine.
I am starting to resent de Beauvoir's hyperbolic diatribe being whipped out and used against us, as if this somehow is the waterline of feminist thought, which I guess is more RadFem heresy. Whatever, I am trying to add to and build upon a body of philosophy rather than just rejecting it because angry woman bad.
I think gender roles adapted as an evolutionary strategy based on the sexual division of labor between men and women. From the biological evolution of sexual reproduction from its asexual precedent, to the metaphysical beliefs of feminine and masculine essence in ancient Greece. Being inherently tied to our evolution as a species, gender roles typically develop cross-culturally as a means of best ensuring survival and the propagation of future generations.
Best ensuring survival meaning what? Overpopulation? Xenophobia? Slavery? Colonialism? All of these have existed since ancient times too, as destructive outgrowths of this order that you are presenting as natural and therefore unquestionable. These are symptoms of a disease of the mind.
Females, being the sex whose physical role is defined by bearing and breastfeeding children, tend to take on a reproductive role in society, while males, the physically stronger and reproductively expendable sex, engage more in hunting, warfare, and other means of providing for and protecting their offspring. Fast forwarding many thousands of years into the 1960s,
that was quite a jump.
The biological role and cultural necessity of sexual dimorphism hit an all-time low.
Wait. Can we unpack that just a little bit?
The cultural necessity of sexual dimorphism hit an all-time low.
You mean the cultural recognition of this necessity hit an all-time low.
The biological role of sexual dimorphism hit an all-time low.
That's the bit that doesn't change.
The biological role of sexual dimorphism hit an all-time low.
No matter how much we may want it to.
As society shifted into a service and knowledge economy where women could be as productive as men, and technologies such as birth control and safe abortion made motherhood a choice, liberating women from many of their biological constraints.
See, framing your biology as a constraint is a symptom of self-hatred. This is what internalized misogyny looks like. It's so easy to spin this ability of ours as a positive. Oh, but it does tend to limit our productivity in the economy. And we obviously need to prioritize that.
And to give one popular account of this gendered creation myth, specifically as it relates to Marxist feminism, I'm actually going to quote a trans activist YouTuber named Lily Alexander.
Yeah. We're going to visit with a couple of actual trans activists, but no actual RadFems, I noticed, which is sort of interesting. But bear with me, I promise it's not that bad.
Somehow, probably with the threat of violence, men took over. They replaced the matrilineal system with a patrilineal one. Then they took it a step further and decided that actually men shouldn't just own the products of their labor, but of women's labor too. Men defined themselves as the owning class and reduced women to a position of servitude, defined not on their own terms, but in relation to men. The second sex that exists only to fill in the gaps. The age of cooperation had ended. In an old unpublished manuscript written by Marx and myself in 1846, I find the words, "The first division of labor is that between man and woman for the propagation of children." And today I can add, the first class opposition that appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male.
And this quote from Marx totally glosses over the fact that this original division of labor was enacted by nature. It's what we make of it that says a whole lot about who we are.
So the modern category of womanhood wasn't invented with our best interest in mind. The womanhood we know today started as a tool to erase cultures, exploit labor, and steal property.
The modern womanhood we know today does have its basis in something like beyond that and before that and beneath all of that.
With this as a historical starting point for their praxis, radical feminists in the 1960s and 70s explicitly stated that their goal was to overcome patriarchy and therefore abolish gender. All that would be left is biological differences.
This does sound great, but what exactly counts as biological differences? Where is that line? Nobody knows.
And the 1970 radical feminist book, Dialectic of Sex, explains this goal, stating, "The end goal of feminist revolution must be, unlike that of the first feminist movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself."
And here we have poor Shulamith Firestone being trotted out again as the mother of radical feminism. Again, did you not even look for any RadFem YouTube channels? Hello?
Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally.
The physical differences are not going to matter culturally. I don't think that's possible because they're not going to go away. And poor Shulamith Firestone was not exactly of the most sound mind. So why exactly are we quoting 40 and 50-year-old books? The more I think about this, the more I wonder about that.
This is seen in its more extreme form a decade later in Monique Wittig's One Is Not Born a Woman, which I'll read some choice quotes from now. "A materialist feminist approach to women's oppression destroys the idea that women are a natural group."
What sort of materialism denies material reality? What sort of feminism obliterates the category it represents? This is corrupt nonsense.
In the case of women, ideology goes far, since our bodies as well as our minds are the product of this manipulation. We have been compelled in our bodies and in our minds to correspond, feature by feature, with the idea of nature that has been established for us.
We do need to fight back against the idea of nature that has been established for us, but there is one.
Thus, it is our historical task, and only ours, to define what we call oppression in materialist terms, to make it evident that women are a class, which is to say that the category woman, as well as the category man, are political and economic categories, not eternal ones.
They are both.
Our fight aims to suppress men as a class, not through a genocidal, but a political struggle. Once the class men disappears, women as a class will disappear as well, for there are no slaves without masters.
If we are no longer slaves, that makes us no longer women? Think about that. To be a woman is to be a slave? This is absolutely dripping with self-hatred, and that's never gonna make for strong philosophy.
So you may think at this point that the goals of critical gender theory seem pretty cut and dry, make the sexes equal and gender becomes an outdated concept, but this is about to be complicated by two very important facts. Number one, the existence of transsexuals.
That's a debatable fact.
And number two, the absolute chokehold that postmodernism would come to take on the gender ideology movement.
That's an interesting way of putting it. She's not wrong about that, though, is she? She's not wrong. She's just overgeneralizing.
This theoretical explosion of postmodernism applied to gender arrived in 1990 with Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.
We've actually addressed Judith Butler specifically here on the channel before. I will link the video down below.
One of the significant markers of post-structuralism and postmodernism as an outgrowth of critical theory is Derrida's conception of deconstruction, which is to remove binary oppositions between terms and allow for a pluralistic multitude of truths. In a traditional philosophical opposition, we have not a peaceful coexistence of facing terms, but a violent hierarchy. One of the terms dominates the other, occupies the commanding position.
A man trying to dismantle hierarchies. A fantastic feat indeed, since that seems to sort of just be the way they view the world.
To deconstruct the opposition is above all, at a particular moment, to reverse the hierarchy.
But like, his argument almost sounds like the position of someone who knows that they're wrong and wants to make it look not that way.
To deconstruct the opposition is above all, at a particular moment, to reverse the hierarchy.
Is it just me?
We saw it in its ultimate form when it was applied to gender in 1990 with Judith Butler. She utilized deconstruction of the binary opposites man and woman and viewed the creation of gender as a subjective and ongoing experience unique to the individual. This is the philosopher who popularized the notion of both gender and sex being social constructs. Dominant gender oppresses individual genders through the tools of language, which is an enforcement of violence and power, through definition, but we can escape the cis-heteropatriarchal normative society of Western capitalism by creating our own genders instead.
So I'm going to go ahead and let her talk for a minute because she did a really good job of summarizing this, actually.
And this conception of infinite genders accomplishes one of two outcomes. The first is that it completely negates the meaning of gender altogether. Basically, woman has no more meaning because meaning is individually constructed by individuals. Or the other outcome of the infinite gender hypothesis is that it stereotypes gender expression to the most extreme form that has never been tried in all of human history, which is antithetical to feminist and liberal notions of gender roles being too restrictive. If something as mundane as not liking the color pink renders you no longer female, and instead one of an infinite number of non-binary genders, then you have an extremely rigid and sexist view of what a woman is.
Haha, you spotted that one. Good job.
Postmodernism's assignment of a prescriptive rather than descriptive role to language, as well as the notion that all of truth is subjective and relative and that there is no observable objective truth, makes simple statements about reality like men can't get pregnant political. It's no longer a description of physical life, it is rather a moral argument that you are making. And to see this view come to life, I'm going to quote another trans activist YouTuber who follows that exact logic when it comes to her criticism of those who are opposed to the gender ideology movement.
Framing philosophy tube this way, I actually really amuses me.
When the anti-gender movement say that gender is an ideology and sex is a fixed point, we now understand. They aren't making an observation. They're making a demand. When they say that you can't change sex, they mean you shouldn't be allowed to.
And I went ahead and sped his pretentious ass up for you because he really doesn't need any more of our time, does he?
Because that would be dangerous. Not the kind of danger that is proven with evidence, but the kind they want the state to posit and punish. What they want is morally righteous violence that restores an imaginary order, because they are anxious about real problems that they cannot or will not think about, and so they can only glimpse those problems through the prism of unreality.
There is still another complication to both radical feminism's idea of gender as well as the Butlerian idea of infinite gender, and that is the existence of quote-unquote true transsexuals, as in transgender people who experience gender dysphoria.
I don't see this as a philosophical problem for radical feminism so much as a problem that might be solved through radical feminism.
Transsexuals and cross-dressers, when looking at the historical record, appear to have been around since at least ancient times. But all conceptions of gender exist in relation to the sexual binary and the bimodal construction of feminine and masculine qualities, as they relate to generalizations we observe about the social expressions of one's physical biological sex. In this view, the language of gender plays a primarily descriptive rather than prescriptive role, with those descriptions changing as observations change.
So having inverted the function of language in this way is quite the mindfuck. But it also robs you of the ability to attempt to describe anything, which sounds suspiciously like the ultimate form of censorship.
And of course, there are intersex people who are born with deviations to their chromosomal makeup and secondary sex characteristics. Scientifically, intersex people are classified as either male or female. There is no ambiguous third sex because sexual reproduction necessarily relies on a binary.
Thank you, right?
We first see gender identity disorder listed in the DSM in 1980 as a mental disorder in which a person feels a deep discomfort in their biological sex and strongly identifies with and wishes to change into the opposite biological sex. In 2013, this was updated to be called gender dysphoria and is often first present in childhood, though some children do grow out of it.
Just in case any of you are new to this topic, I actually thought this was a nice little introduction. Or it's a nice refresher, right? Just to make sure we're all on the same page.
For some people, though, the sense of dysphoria lasts into adulthood and doesn't go away.
And by this definition, at 25, I count it as true trans. I'm not willing to give up the last 15 years of my life. Personally, I've managed to become pretty comfortable in my own skin, and I'm fairly proud of that. The idea that they would be going around telling people like me that they need surgery and medication for that, instead of acceptance, is really horrifying to me.
And currently, the best technologies we have to alleviate these symptoms are through things like cross-sex hormones and sexual reassignment surgery.
What is the source for this? We compared last week in the CAS report where it said that there is little evidence from benefits of psychotherapy, just like there is little evidence from benefits of puberty blockers. But so now you're leaving out the idea of psychotherapy altogether? Why do we need technology to treat these symptoms? What a phrasing.
And this is where the most common notion of transgender comes from. Since the explosion of the million gender movement online, however, there has been a tension between those who believe that transgenderism is an innate mental illness, something that you have no control over, and those who think that you can claim trans identity for any reason whatsoever, all reasons are valid. The idea that someone is not born trans also doesn't exactly play well into the idea of transgender people being an oppressed class or deserving legal protection, because it just makes it seem like it's a choice like any other.
So she's got a really interesting angle of approach, I think, to the ball of contradictions that is transgender ideology.
And a lot of activists will compare gender dysphoria being in the DSM to how homosexuality was in the DSM. Homosexuality does not inherently and independently breed suffering and distress. There is nothing about being gay that makes you suffer. In the same way, there's nothing about being Black that makes you suffer. Gender dysphoria, on the other hand, is an inherently distressing experience. It results from the mismatch between your perception and observable physical reality, which is basically as close to a definition of mental illness that you can get.
This is a really good point. I think more people should be making it. This is why trans is a mental illness by definition, okay? Because being gay doesn't hurt. Being Black doesn't hurt. Gender dysphoria is painful by definition.
But going back to legal phenomena, that is kind of at the crux of the debate between TERFs as well as the postmodern trans activists in today's time. And so with that, let's take a look at the TERF point of view. When it comes to radical feminism, which views gender as a purely environmental rather than biological process.
Which, that is the attitude, but is that official? Because I'm just going to have to sit with what experience has taught me, which is that no, behavior has some biological basis. We work so hard to identify with our female selves and then have this notion that it's not supposed to affect us in any way. It just seems kind of contradictory to me, and again, perhaps a little bit of internalized misogyny there.
The existence of transgender people is typically construed to be a symptom of a very rigid patriarchal society that boxes people into very strict categories of man or woman.
Yeah.
With gender abolition, we can express our femininity and masculinity however we please.
How exactly we would know what those are in this hypothetical future, but where being male or female doesn't actually mean anything. Who knows?
And all that matters at the end of the day is our biological sex when it comes to things like protections for childbirth, like maternity leave, those kinds of issues. To quote feminist psychologist Sandra Bem in her 1993 book, Lenses of Gender, she discusses this view herself in response to gender identity disorders being classified as mental illness. My hypothesis is that it is partly an exceedingly rare extension into adulthood of the erroneous and non-biological lesson that almost all American parents teach their young children about what male and female are. For whatever reason, the transsexual starts life with extremely gender non-conforming preferences in activities, playmates, clothing, and the like. After learning erroneously, like almost every other child, that the sexes are defined by these cultural gender markers, he or she attaches the wrong sex label to the self.
And I included this less than scientific definition of gender dysphoria because I agree with it entirely. That was my experience to a T.
And the trans experience, especially when rooted in dysphoria, throws a wrench into this point of view because it asserts that gender is an essential aspect of who you are. It does have to do with your biological sex in some kind of way.
I don't believe that developing that sense of yourself in a dysfunctional way counteracts the idea that it is somehow innately developed. So how exactly does the dysfunctional development of your internal concept of your sex-based social role demonstrate that it's not sex-based? How does that contradict the idea? I don't... Seriously, am I missing something here? It's late. This is obviously editing Sarah. You guys help me on the comments, really. I'm tired.
And while TERFs can write off trans men, so women transitioning into being men, as escaping the patriarchy, oh, women have to make that choice because patriarchy oppresses them and subjugates them into womanhood, so they want to escape it by becoming the ruling class. They can kind of write that off and still have their beliefs in this overarching patriarchy.
Writing them off? That is not the attitude that I have ever encountered anywhere. Every RadFem I have ever talked to about that was pretty sympathetic to the idea of escaping patriarchy somehow.
But that argument doesn't hold up when it comes to trans women, men transitioning into womanhood, because if being women is so awful and oppressive, why would a man, the privileged dominant class, become one?
You just spent several minutes describing how this is a mental illness. And now you're trying to say that this doesn't make sense because it's not rational? Mental illnesses are not rational. You're assuming these men have any real understanding of what it is they're asking for.
It can only be one of two reasons. Number one, the patriarchy is not that intense, which the radical feminists will never admit. Or number two, these men are just like perverts who are trying to oppress women in a more innocuous way.
I think in some cases that is actually certainly true as well.
Otherwise, why would a man give up his privileged role? And to be fair, there are certainly predators who take on a trans identity, especially with self-identification and so on. And with that in mind, I do agree with the TERF talking points in the sense that we really need to be careful about who we assign to women's prisons and domestic violence shelters and so on, and other places where, as a woman, you maybe do not want to be around a man. I don't think trans women should compete in women's sports. That's completely unfair. And so in that sense, against this postmodern idea of all of knowledge and reality being constructed by individuals and there not being objective truth, the TERFs are kind of like the biggest fighters against this notion when it comes to biological sex for the purposes of legal protection of women or females.
Hell yeah, we are. You're welcome. Why don't you just join us then?
Overall, though, while I think biological sex, really matters in certain legal disputes and everything, overall, I'm not a TERF because, number one, I'm not a radical feminist.
Some of them are genuinely hateful to men. Misandry is not feminism because it's not about the men, is it?
And number two, I'm not trans exclusionary.
I agree with them, but I don't identify with them because they're so mean. Why is it that they're so mean? Do extremists in a group render all of its values void? Obviously not. You just said you agree with a bunch of them. Rather than look into what it is they're so angry about, you assume it to be unjustified because you find it distasteful. Did you ever stop and ask yourself why it is you find women's anger too distasteful to even attempt to understand it? I may not endorse a lot of that rage, but I certainly understand it.
But we do have to find a middle ground of reality in which, yes, there are biological differences between men and women, and you can't actually change your full biology.
That is a lovely utopian vision that you've set up for yourself. Claire refers to herself as a centrist liberal because she puts the progressives on the far left and, obviously the conservatives on the right. So she as a liberal is a reasonable centrist, which is fine. We all think of ourselves as reasonable, right? And she really is. She makes a pretty solid argument here, which is one of the reasons I found that so amusing. Personally, I don't see some of the conflicts that she's assuming for radical feminism, but that's, I've really tried to make my own little corner in this philosophy because I do identify with a lot of it, and so I've just sort of adopted it and I'm making it my own. Because I think that's how philosophy works. I think that's how you keep it alive. Isn't it? Right? Anyway, I sure hope so. Because exploring the line between nature and nurture in behavior is one of the ongoing projects of this channel, and I really found her take on this topic to be super interesting. So thank you, Claire, for your guidance on our little romp through feminist and gender theory. I have been Rad Mom. Thank you for joining me out here in the garden. Come back at the top of the hour for the live stream and discussion where we will absolutely dig into more feminist theory. And check back next Wednesday for a brand new video. Okay. Thanks a lot. See you then. Bye.